We are most certainly seeing folks packing up and heading out of California.
Hello and Happy New Year. I'm Alex Cohen.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And this is the first installation of the Inside the Issues podcast for 2024. Sara, it is great to have you back. I feel like it's been a million years since you've been here.
I know. I'm so happy to be back.
And a million things have happened. I mean, we hit January and boom, 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 a whole lot of news that we're going to be talking about, including Let Them Eat Cake, or most cake except for one particular bakery's cake with the shutdown of Sweet Lady Jane Cakes pretends about Golden State politics. We can talk about that.
Absolutely. And another big piece that's on the agenda for 2024 is that Golden State is also going to be facing a $68 billion, the billion with a B, dollar deficit.
Yeah.
We will break it all down.
Yes. And some really interesting things have been coming into play when it comes to whether or not former President Donald Trump will be on the ballot in various states. Why the governor of California is saying, yep, keep him on the ballot. We will talk about that, too. Let's jump into it now. Sara, with this story, it was so funny. This was, I think, the first story of the year. We were going to pull back the curtain. All throughout the week, Sara and I are like DMing each other and texting each other and emailing each other. Do you see this? Do you see that? That is how the sausage is made here. And I think this was officially the first story of 2024 that you sent to me about Sweet Lady Jane Cakes.
Yes. And, you know, we always cover political stories. And I was like, when I first saw the headline, I was like, well, this isn't exactly political. And then as I'm reading it, I'm like, wait, why are they leaving California?
Yeah.
Sweet Lady Jane Cakes, right?
They've been around for 35 years. I will say, are you a big fan of the triple berry cake?
I have to admit, I've never had the triple.
Okay, I'm glad you know, because it's funny. Like everyone,
I'm not really a West Side kind of gal.
No, they've got multiple locations now, and I know
it's like a Taylor Swift thing.
It is.
Yes,
I've definitely been to places where there has been Sweet Lady Jane Cakes, and I'll say triple berry cake is just in general one of my. No, I'm not. I do love me a good lightly frosted berry cake. But this cake was legendary.
Yes,
it was like the place where if it was your special birthday party or for your wedding, and Taylor Swift even got introduced by some famous person and had the cake. Yeah. So it became as a big surprise. And what was interesting was this company, Sweet Lady Jane, decides to shut down all of their stores, but they tell the world about it afterwards. Yeah. Not like, hey, not like Toys R Us.
Right.
Everybody
Yesterday was our last
sailing.
day.
It was, hey, that ship has already sailed. If you didn't get the cake, you're not getting the cake. Everybody kind of freaked out, and it was like pouring out for Sweet Lady Jane. But they also put out a statement which said, "We did not come to this decision lightly nor quickly. While the support and loyalty of our customers has been strong, sales are not strong enough to continue doing business in the state of California, allowing us to service our lease obligations and pay our treasured employees a living wage without passing those costs directly on to you." So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Maybe we jump into our first edition in 2024 of our regular segment, What's the Word? Sara, the word is?
Remain.
And so Sweet Lady Jane saying we can no longer remain here, and kind of like in a not so direct way pointing the finger at the state of California saying it's too expensive
to operate here in California, in LA, in LA in particular.
Yeah. And this is not the first headline of this sort that we have seen. There was also a big headline that happened towards the end of 2023. Pizza Hut in Southern California announcing somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 workers who are going to be laid off as the minimum wage for fast food workers gets bumped up to $20 an hour. Right. And here I think the overall minimum wage is bumped up to 16 now in California. Yeah. So, you know, the big question is what businesses will be able to remain here in the state, especially in Southern California, with minimum wage going up.
These are tricky things, and I hate that this only gets put on minimum wage, right? Because there's so many other costs associated with doing business in California.
Absolutely.
And so while, you know, certainly the Sweet Lady Jane statement referenced not only a minimum wage, but a living wage, and I can appreciate the distinction there.
Sure.
So thank you to this folks at Sweet Lady Jane. There are all sorts of other issues with doing business in California, right? There's insurance. There's all sorts of safety protocols that have to be followed. Taxes, right, friends?
Yeah.
Right? Like these are all some of these ongoing things we've heard for the last year, and some of it has been debunked as well, about like smash and grabs and all, all of these pieces as well. Like how challenging it is to actually operate businesses here in California. This has been an ongoing narrative, and it seems like this narrative is going to remain with us for quite some time.
Oh, yeah.
Because we are most certainly seeing folks packing up and heading out of California.
Case in point, right around the corner from my house in Atwater Village is, it's a really interesting story. It used to be a nursing home, an adult nursing home. And then one day it shut down and it got totally gutted and converted into this restaurant called Bon Vivant. Everyone in the neighborhood was so excited. And it is owned by a woman named Tricia LaBelle. She's president of the Greater Los Angeles Hospitality Association. She owns 6 different bars and restaurants throughout LA and Hollywood. And I was talking to her recently. She was like, yeah, I'm leaving LA. I think I'm closing down the restaurant and going. And she pointed to all the things you just mentioned, all of the lawsuits that come up, the insurance, which used to be on some of her properties like $7,000 a year. Now it's $70,000 a year. And she said, look, when it comes to how expensive it is to live in California and the increases in minimum wage, she's like, look, I get it, but I don't know if that's something that we can just kind of make a blanket statement on. Take a listen to what Tricia told me.
I have bartenders that are making a couple $100,000 a year. So when I get told that they can't live on minimum wage, maybe someone in a retail atmosphere or an office atmosphere that is making a straight minimum wage with no tips, that might be a viable industry. Something that in my industry has been trying to fight for is a tip wage, where we pay a lesser minimum wage and offset it by their tips that they earn. The state has refused to acknowledge it. The labor unions have fought against it with all sorts of excuses not to allow it. But the tips that these kids make certainly make them able to afford well lifestyles.
Tricia told me that she literally has issued paychecks that have never been cashed by some of her employees because, I don't even need to cash this check. Yeah. I'm just living off the tips. And I think that there is something to be said about that, about, okay, when California makes these blanket laws, is that working? Is that the best use of the law? But then how do you craft out and do all these carve-outs for individuals? And I'm sure that there are some people who are not making great tips out there. And then what do you do about them?
Right, exactly. I have a little bit of skin, maybe old skin in the game on this one because, in my earlier days, I put myself through school waiting tables, not here in California, but back in the state of Pennsylvania. And I was paid, I think it was $2.25 an hour because it was a tip wage.
Yep.
And, the hope was, I worked at some decent Italian restaurants, and the hope was, you can make hopefully $100 a night in tips. Back then. Rent was much cheaper, obviously. Sure. I knew that if I could get 5 shifts in a week, I could make rent for within the first week of the month, right? Like this is literally how you kind of have to think when you work in the service industry and rely on tips. I was in my early 20s. I didn't have kids to account for.
Right. Mortgages.
Right. Mortgages, right. Like the cost of my living was definitely less. So when I think about tinkering with that formula, it's really hard for me to think about but what about, I know in her statement she talked about, well, these kids are making all this money, but for many people, this is their career. This is their entire life, right? These aren't kids necessarily. And there might be people that they are supporting beyond just themselves. And so for me, I'm kind of hesitant on tinkering with that minimum wage piece because I think it's great. Though, look, we live in a generous tip culture. Some restaurants have
But now people are balking at it. They're like, I'm tired of,
tipping at the self-serve.
At the self-serve.
Froyo place.
Right? And I've yelled. I'm like, what do you mean? I'll tip myself. Thank you very much.
Yes.
But actually, that is a really good segue to what this whole story made me think a lot about in terms of what remains and what doesn't in Southern California. I always feel like ride sharing is a metaphor for so many things that are happening in the world. I grew up in a taxi era. Yeah. There was one way that you got to the airport. Yeah. It was a taxi or maybe a super shuttle, right?
Yeah.
But you opened up the old phone book and you called the number for Yellow Cab and someone showed up until ride sharing came along. And once that happened, everything got turned on its head. And I think everybody saw, okay, we might have been doing this thing this way for decades, but just because we've done something this way for decades doesn't mean we need to keep doing it. And I think that actually the same is true for restaurants and bakeries. I want to tell you a fun little story, Sarah. Over the holidays, I I had some friends over for New Year's Eve. I like to do tamales on New Year's Eve because I'm a
Are
true
you
Southern
making
California.
this?
Oh, hell no. That would be a disaster. And I have a friend who I invited over with her kids, and they are proud vegans. And she was like, oh, you don't have to worry. So I'm like, no, come on, Amy, you're a vegan.
Yeah.
We're going to do vegan tamales. And then I was like, oh, no, I don't know where the heck I'm going to find vegan tamales. And it was literally the day before.
No, I read about a place that has vegan tamales.
Okay, so there are, but
Yeah,
here's the thing. So I had also, my favorite bakery, I'm going to give a shout out. They're not paying me in sourdough, although I would love it. They're called Out of Thin Air. They just popped up recently, and they don't have a brick and mortar store. They live on social media channels. They show up at the farmer's market. And I saw a post right before Christmas where they said, if you want holiday orders, place an order and you can pick them up at our place in Lincoln Heights. I'm like, I'm in. I'll do it. So Christmas Eve, I'm waiting outside this place on Lincoln Heights, and I start looking. It's this row of these ghost kitchens, right? Which have popped up more recently.
Yes,
and
especially in
sure
COVID.
enough, there was a vegan tamale place. And I was like, Eureka!
Yeah.
I got my vegan tamales. And as I'm waiting for the sourdough bread, I felt like such a hip 21st century Southern California on my phone. I placed my vegan tamale order, and 5 minutes later, the lovely lady, they were delicious. They were super affordable.
Yeah.
And it was kind of perfect because I've done the traditional brick and mortar tamale shops on Christmas Eve. And that is like a 4-hour line to get to Space Mountain at Disneyland kind of ordeal on Christmas Eve.
Totally.
And I hate it. It's super stressful. So maybe all of this is just a way, maybe the sweet
I hope
Lady
we don't
Jane,
get rid of all brick and mortar restaurants
No,
like that.
and I
No,
don't think we
I know.
will.
No, of course not. I know that, right? But like, I hear what you're saying, that maybe there's this new way.
Maybe there's a
but
new
there needs to be
sweet
both.
lady,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Exactly. And we think
Sweet
of
lady
all
Jane.
of the food culture and the interplay between food, which is such a huge industry here, and politics that led to Roy Choi starting the Kogi trucks, that led to Lula
absolutely,
Lefebvre
right?
starting
And
the
whole
pop-up restaurants.
Food truck culture. Yeah,
Right?
totally. I will say, though, in terms of all these businesses leaving, I as you know, I just came back from the state of Alabama, a place
were
I
looking
never
for an adjective, and you found
Let
none.
me not use any adjective, but I had never in my life really had a deep desire to go to Alabama. But I have to tell you, I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, I was only there for a day, but beautiful homes of the style of like a Joanna Gaines from HGTV, and cost of living so much less, right on the bayou and all that. It was kind of nice. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, I can see why so many people want to leave California for all these like pop-up new cities.
Yeah.
The cost of living is so much less, and it.
And did you see the story that
Wasn't
now
as
they're
bad as I
saying the
thought.
more intellectuals are the ones who are leaving California? This is what the
I
latest
believe it.
demographic reports,
I
which
believe it.
actually is a really great way to pivot and talk to our next item of the week. The fiscal fortunes of California. We've talked about this before, right?
Yeah.
After many very flush years here in the state when it came to our budget, record-breaking budgets, we had these series of unfortunate events, right, where we had tax season delayed because of these natural disasters, so we weren't quite sure what people were going to have. And now we finally have that amount, and it's $68 billion deficit. So you're going from big surplus to big deficit. A lot of people are saying like, oh, we've seen worse, but it's still a pretty big deficit. And next week, Governor Gavin Newsom is going to release his plan of how we close the gap. And this isn't even $68 million, which would be a really huge number to me, is $68 billion. So there is no way that there won't be cuts, which means Gavin Newsom's going to have to think a lot about his priorities and his legacy, and we as a state are going to have to think about, especially during a time that I don't feel like anybody feels particularly flush or secure or like they're doing great.
Yeah.
It's a little scary.
It is scary. And I think there's so many pieces to this. He's going to have to think about cuts for sure. I mean, if we relate it to this Sweet Lady Jane's kind of piece and Pizza Hut, right? I mean, when we're thinking about businesses that say they are leaving California, that's also a tax base, right?
Yes,
like, so we are losing folks who are actually paying that business tax. And if that trend actually continues, I don't actually have the full numbers on how many. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges is really quantifying how many businesses are actually leaving, what the tax base is that we are losing out on. But we could end up with a really mismatched state, right?
Yeah.
Where we're not necessarily pumping out the kind of productivity that we otherwise would have. And I think that's one concern, although it sounds like Newsom has some thoughts about how to pump that up in terms of our tech sector.
Well, no, I
Yeah.
mean, it's interesting because one of the pieces that I read about this had this statistic, which has really stuck with me, is that a fifth of our budget, 20% of our budget, comes from the tech sector.
Mm-hmm.
And as we have seen, that is a really volatile sector. I think we were lulled into this idea, this dream that it would remain like we were Silicon Valley. We were the originators of the tech movement. So tech will always be here and it will always be strong. Baby, I lived in the Bay Area during the first .com boom and bust. And I can't tell you how visceral those pink slip parties, that stuff crashed and burned. And so I've always seen it as very cyclical, and I wonder how much our state leaders are really thinking about, yes, they've put aside money in the rainy day funds. I think it's a different world than it was, back when Mayor Karen Bass was a state legislator and, very different era. But still, I think, what's going to remain in this budget and what won't, and the timing of it, that also in the first week of this year, this week, Governor Newsom was in Southern California. He made 2 appearances earlier this week. One of them was at UCLA, seems to be doing pretty well because they just bought the West Side Pavilion and the mall of my childhood. Well, I didn't live on the West Side, but when I would visit my posh friends, we'd go to the West Side Pavilion. And UCLA's bought that campus. They're going to turn it into this big, innovative health hub. And so it was interesting at the same time that we're facing this big budget deficit because all these tech companies aren't doing that well. We're investing in a lot of biotech, which may be a smarter corner of tech. I don't know. But he was also here touting his Proposition 1, which is the bond measure that would raise a whole lot of money. This is the treatment, not tense. And he appeared with Mayor Bass. And I think it's going to be really interesting. That's going to be on the March ballot. How well people really read into ballot measures like that one. It's not a simple one like, protect abortion in the Constitution or ban vaping or whatever. This one's a little bit more nuanced, and it's economics, which I know a lot of people don't necessarily get into. But if people were to vote on it today, let's say, maybe they'd be like, homelessness, it's a big problem. We got to get people off the streets. I vote yes on this. But if they're starting to see like, hey, there's all these places, my after school care, my medical benefits, but maybe they're like, you know what? I got to think about me first. I don't know if I want money necessarily going there. I want it going to me and my family. That's what I want to have remain.
No, absolutely. And I think one other, element to all of this with this looming budget crisis is also we're going into a major election year. And this budget crisis will be on the minds of voters. And this is absolutely something that candidates are going to have to be thinking about here in California, but also on that national ballot as well. We're going to have to see how candidates sort of are positioning themselves, not only in the primaries, but certainly by the time we get to November.
Well, we know at the top of the ticket how the candidates are positioning themselves. Joe Biden out there really still trying to work that message. I'm not too old. The economy is in good shape. I know what I'm doing.
The elephant, buddy.
right. Although now he's joking about it, which I think is kind of funny. I love a good I'm really old joke because I make them all the time now myself.
Agreed.
But Donald Trump, on the other hand, really hitting hard on Biden and the economy, world affairs, all the rest of it. And it looks like Donald Trump will be on the ballot during our March 5th primary. And this was another end of the year story. Maybe you were taking a news break. I certainly wouldn't blame you if you did after the year that 2023 was. But there was an interesting kind of evolution here. Back in the fall, there were 9 state legislators led by Evan Lowe who wrote to our state attorney general and recent guest on the pod, Rob Bonta, saying, could you look into it and see whether or not it's kosher for Donald Trump to remain on the ballot, considering he kind of started an insurrection, the 14th Amendment, yada, yada, yada. And then you fast forward to December, and Eleni Kounalakis, the lieutenant governor, wrote...
Who has already announced she's running for governor.
Yes, in 2026, and might well be facing Rob Bonta, although he hasn't officially announced yet. She made a query to the Secretary of State, Shirley Weber, saying, hey, can we look into maybe not having Donald Trump on the ballot? And basically that answer was nope. Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. And Gavin
And you have
Newsom,
thoughts about this.
I sure do. And Gavin Newsom, to his credit, jumped in right away saying absolutely not. Here in the state of California, we go to the polls to make
defeat
decisions.
the exact
Yes.
quote, because yes, there is no doubt that Donald Trump is a threat to our liberties and even to our democracy. But in California, we defeat candidates at the polls. Everything else is a political distraction.
Does that
mean Alex
agree.
Cohen was a political distraction?
I mean,
His lieutenant governor?
it sure seems like that's what he's saying, right? Look, yeah, is Donald Trump bad for democracy? Yes. But the question of whether or not the 14th Amendment, which has all this language about if you lead an insurrection, you are not qualified for the ballot. But we have never used it. There is no legal precedent for it. This is a federal question, not a state question. This is a court's question, not a politician's question. And I think from this statement, I think Gavin Newsom understands that. There are national conversations. Look, after the 2020 election, Donald Trump led not just the insurrection on January 6th, but the momentum that brought death threats to election officials, to state secretaries of state in places like Michigan, election officials in Arizona, in Georgia. There's phone calls of him asking the Secretary of State of Georgia to find him 12,000 ballots.
Yeah.
This is outrageous behavior, but it is something for the courts to decide, not Eleni Kounalakis.
Well, and I got to think, too, if you're Secretary of State Shirley Weber, there's another element to all of this, which is, let's say you did say, okay, we're taking you off the ballot, Donald Trump. What would the impact of that be? It's not like Trump, like I think of the GOP candidates, I think he will prevail. But when it comes to the general election, like Trump is not going to win California. That is one political bet I think is fairly safe to say, right? So what's the point? And I think what it would do, especially how many people who were arrested for their involvement in January 6th were from here in California. And I could definitely see the impact if Trump were not to remain on the ballot, being that this is further evidence to me that the whole system is rigged against my guy.
Exactly.
And I don't believe it in anymore. And the danger to folks like Shirley Weber and local registrars and election workers would be pretty severe.
Pretty severe and intense. I completely agree with that. Look, there is a real problem in terms of the perception that Americans have, and I'm not talking just about Californians here, but Americans across the United States have about the security of our elections. Actually, our elections are very secure. We saw that in 2020. We saw it again in 2022, and election officials have done an incredible job. Because in fact, when people have said, well, let me see how these ballots are counted, they go in and say, oh, yeah, they counted them right. Actually, counting ballots is a kind of a boring thing. And most of the election officials across the country are doing phenomenal jobs, and we need to be applauding them, not going after them in the way that Trump did. And therefore, this is an issue for the Supreme Court. Colorado's Supreme Court was right to bring this case in Colorado and to it will now go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to have to decide it. And if a court that is as conservative as this one is decides that Trump should not be on the ballot because he started an insurrection, then people will believe it, right? That hopefully will respond to some of this perception. But if the blue state of California does it, that's not going to really bode well. I have so many more thoughts about this in terms of, we can go back to looking at Bush v. Gore. We can think about even citizenship questions that the Supreme Court has voted against Trump. But
I have a feeling one of the huge themes of 2024, if not the theme, will be that intersection between the law and politics. 91 indictments against the former president and leading presidential candidate in the Republican Party. That's not going away. Neither, unfortunately, is the situation in the Middle East, which has had a huge impact here this week in California. The first day of the state legislature, protesters showed up in support of a ceasefire, and they couldn't even get started, really. I mean, the whole thing got shut down. And we're continuing to see the reverberations of this in the world of academia, which you and I talked about a lot in 2023. Harvard President Claudine Gay, no longer a Harvard president, still a professor of political science, but she tendered her resignation, much like Sweet Lady Jane's, bringing it full circle. She said,
Claudine Gay will not remain.
No, will not remain. Sarah, I know you've got some feels. This
is a really tough one for me. Claudine Gay writes as an academic, was writing back in the late 90s about Black voting behavior. Much of my own work on Asian Americans, her work served as a model to me in thinking about voting behavior. So this one cuts to cuts you right in the heart. I actually don't know her, but I certainly know of her work. This was a tough one because it was clear in many ways that this was a conservative movement to take her down from the get-go, largely stemming from the tenor on campuses following October 7th, the push from donors, et cetera. And of course, those hearings on Capitol Hill. However, I have to say the plagiarism stuff, that's a tough one for me because, I don't allow it from my students.
Yeah.
It's a painful one. And on some levels, I'm like, I kind of can see where you could possibly be inspired by someone else's work and have it included, but just put the quotes around it, cite it. There is no reason to lift passages and put it in your own work. And I think in that regard, Harvard as one of the premier institutions, and I don't just say that because I have fellowship there, but
that's right.
That's
right, Sarah. And you're going there later this month, as students are getting back. Oh my God!
Yeah,
I can't wait.
I will report back.
Yes,
for
you
sure.
will. I just want to put a nice little California bow on this because, as we mentioned earlier, Gavin Newsom was it was in Southern California at the West Side Pavilion with all of the bigwigs from UCLA this week. And during the Q&A portion, this was about a biotech center and had nothing to do with Harvard, the Middle East, Claudine Gay, any of it. Yeah. But one of the reporters asked, and it was this really awkward moment, especially because the first person to respond was Michael Drake, the president of UCLA, the first Black president in the entire 125-year history of UCLA. And my sense was that it must have been an incredibly awkward and difficult, especially he's not a poli-sci guy. He's a medical guy. But then Gavin Newsom saunters on up to the mic, and he definitely, the dude was, usually if it's a question that doesn't have to do with the topic of the press conference, he bats it off like flies. This one, he was like, oh, let's go. Let's take a look at what he had to say about the political motivations of what happened with Claudine Gay at Harvard.
The vandalism that's being done politically by the other party in a lot of these red states is not only worrisome, will have profound consequences on the state of this nation and our competitiveness around the rest of the globe.
Interesting, because one little post note and something for everyone to think about is that as he was saying all of this, just behind him was Gene Block, the very long-time chancellor of UCLA, who just announced that he's retiring. And they're currently searching for a successor. And the big question that I have, I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on UCLA, which I believe now is number 1 or number 2 most applied to university in the nation, here in Southern California. White men have been the head of that university for so long. Wouldn't this be an amazing time to have a person of color, a woman, ideally a woman of color? But look at how that turned out at Harvard, is what I have this terrible sinking feeling will be part of the conversations going on behind closed doors. It is a tough time in the news business, but it's also a tough time in academia too. And there are some days I'm very glad that I get to stick in my little corner. That is it for our maiden voyage here in 2024. We'd love to know your opinions on Claudine Gay, UCLA, any of the things that we've talked about this week. You can find us on social media. I'm there at Alex Cohen in LA.
And I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
Happy New Year. The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Nathan Leathers is our editor. The executive in charge of production is Daisy Espinoza.